There is a moment in life when you finally realize something powerful, your energy is sacred. Your attention is not something to be begged for, chased, or wasted on uncertainty. And yet so many people find themselves trapped in a cycle where they give too much to someone who gives too little in return. You reach out. You try to understand. You adjust yourself, your words, your timing, even your emotions, hoping for connection. But the more you chase, the more they step back. Not always because they don't care, but because avoidance often hides fear. Fear of closeness, fear of responsibility, fear of emotional exposure. And here is where the shift begins, not in what you do to them, but in what you finally decide about yourself. Because there comes a point where exhaustion turns into awakening. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-giving. You stop reaching into silence that never reaches back. And instead of collapsing into emotional pursuit, you do something unexpected. You pause. You step back. You choose silence, not as punishment, but as protection. And in that silence, something remarkable happens. The dynamic changes. The energy that once flowed outward in desperation now turns inward in awareness. You begin to see clearly what was once clouded by emotion. You realize that chasing someone who consistently withdraws is not love, it is self-abandonment disguised as connection. True emotional strength is not about forcing someone to stay. It is about recognizing when your presence is not being valued and refusing to dilute yourself any further. Because when you stop begging for attention, you reclaim something far more valuable, your dignity. And that is when the real shift occurs. Silence has a way of speaking louder than words ever could. Not because it is loud, but because it is complete. It removes access. It removes emotional control. It removes the comfort of knowing you will always be available no matter how little is given in return. For someone who is used to emotional distance being filled by your pursuit, your silence becomes unfamiliar. It disrupts the pattern. It creates reflection. It forces a moment of truth, not just for them, but for you. Because now you are no longer reacting. You are choosing. And choice is where power returns. This is not about manipulation. It is not about playing games. It is about alignment. It is about refusing to participate in dynamics where your worth is measured by how much you suffer for attention. When you finally stop chasing, you begin to notice something profound. You don't actually lose love. You lose confusion. You lose anxiety. You lose emotional dependency that was slowly draining your strength. And in that space, something new begins to grow. Clarity. Clarity about what you deserve. Clarity about what you will no longer accept. Clarity about the kind of love that does not require chasing, proving, or shrinking yourself. And sometimes, yes, your silence will trigger a reaction in the other person. It may make them question. It may make them return. It may make them realize what they took for granted. But that is not the goal.
The goal is not their reaction.
The goal is your liberation. Because the highest form of strength is not in how loudly you fight for someone, it is in how peacefully you walk away from what is not aligned with your value. And when you reach that state, you no longer wait to be chosen. You choose yourself, and that changes everything. Avoidant behavior in relationships is rarely as simple as indifference. On the surface, it may look like someone pulling away, going silent, or creating distance. But beneath that surface is often a much more complex emotional wiring one, shaped by fear rather than lack of feeling. Many avoidant individuals are not disconnected because they don't care. They are disconnected because closeness itself feels overwhelming, unfamiliar, or even threatening. When a person begins to withdraw, the natural human response is often to pursue. We try harder. We explain more. We reach out again and again, believing that consistency and emotional effort will eventually bridge the gap. But what is often misunderstood in this dynamic is that avoidance is not solved by more pursuit. In fact, pursuit can unintentionally intensify the very fear that is causing the withdrawal in the first place. At the core of avoidant behavior is usually a protective mechanism. Somewhere in their emotional history, closeness may have been associated with loss of control, emotional pressure, disappointment, or even rejection. As a result, distance becomes a form of safety. It is not necessarily a rejection of the other person, it is a reflexive step back from emotional intensity itself. This is why the more someone pushes for connection, the more the avoidant individual may retreat, not out of cruelty, but out of internal discomfort. Understanding this changes everything. Because instead of personalizing the behavior as I am not enough or I am not wanted, you begin to see a different truth. This is about their capacity, not your value. That distinction is powerful. It shifts the emotional center of gravity back to where it belongs with you. When you repeatedly chase someone who is emotionally pulling away, something subtle begins to happen to your self-perception. You start measuring your worth by their response. You begin to believe that if you just say the right thing, or give a little more, or wait a little longer, things will finally stabilize. But in reality, this dynamic often creates imbalance. One person becomes the pursuer, the other becomes the distancer, and the relationship becomes defined by tension rather than mutual presence. This is where awareness becomes your greatest strength. Because once you understand that avoidance is not a puzzle you can solve by overgiving, you begin to step back from compulsion and into clarity. You realize that emotional security cannot be built through persuasion. It can only exist where there is mutual willingness to engage. And here is where a deeper truth emerges. Love that requires you to abandon yourself in order to maintain it is not alignment, it is depletion. When your nervous system is constantly activated, waiting for responses, analyzing silence, or trying to decode mixed signals, you are no longer in connection. You are in emotional survival mode. Avoidant dynamics often trap both people in an invisible cycle. One person fears being overwhelmed, so they retreat. The other fears losing connection, so they pursue. The more one steps back, the more the other moves forward. And without awareness, this cycle can continue endlessly, creating exhaustion on both sides. But the moment you recognize the pattern, you gain choice. And choice is where transformation begins. You can still care about someone deeply, but you no longer have to abandon your emotional stability to keep them close. You can acknowledge their distance without turning it into a reflection of your worth. You can stop interpreting silence as something you must fix. This is not about shutting down emotionally. It is about stepping into emotional maturity. It is about realizing that real connection cannot be forced into existence through effort alone. It requires willingness from both sides. And where that willingness is absent, no amount of chasing will create lasting stability. So the shift is not in trying harder. The shift is in seeing clearer. And when you see clearly, you stop reacting from fear and start responding from self-respect. Silence, when it is born out of emotional clarity rather than pain, becomes one of the most powerful expressions of self-respect a person can embody. Most people misunderstand silence in relationships. They think it is punishment, withdrawal, or a way to provoke reaction. But true silence is none of those things. It is not designed to control someone else, it is designed to restore you. When you reach a point where you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, and stop trying to earn consistency from someone who is inconsistent, something profound begins to shift inside you. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. Your mind wants to act. Your emotions want to reach out. Your history tells you that effort is what keeps connection alive. But beneath that conditioning is a deeper truth waiting to emerge. Not all effort leads to connection. Sometimes it leads to self-abandonment. Silence becomes meaningful the moment it is no longer driven by emotional collapse. There is a difference between silence that comes from hurt and silence that comes from awareness. Hurt-based silence still waits for validation. It still hopes for a response. It is still emotionally attached to an outcome. But awareness-based silence is different. It is grounded. It is steady. It says, I no longer need to chase what does not meet me halfway. And this is where self-respect begins to take shape, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. When you stop filling every gap with words, explanations, and emotional pursuit, you begin to hear something you were missing before: yourself. You start to notice how much of your energy was previously directed outward into someone else's attention, someone else's mood, someone else's availability. And in that realization, you reclaim parts of yourself that were quietly being drained. Silence also changes the emotional field between you and the other person. Not because manipulates, but because it removes accessibility. When someone is used to your consistent emotional availability, your sudden absence of reaction creates space. That space can lead to reflection, confusion, or even discomfort. But none of that is your responsibility anymore. Your responsibility is no longer to manage their emotional experience, it is to protect your own. There is a quiet strength in no longer reacting, in no longer trying to decode every delay, every distance, every shift tone. Because every reaction you once gave was energy invested into uncertainty. And over time, that uncertainty begins to shape how you see yourself. You start to question your value, your worth, your role in the connection. Silence interrupts that cycle. It creates a boundary where emotional overextension once lived. And boundaries are not walls, they are clarity. They define where your responsibility ends and where another person's begins. When you stop overgiving your attention to inconsistent behavior, you begin to restore balance within yourself. This is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about becoming anchored. You can still feel deeply, still care, still acknowledge the connection, but you are no longer willing to lose yourself inside it. That is the transformation. And often what surprises people most is what silence reveals. It shows you who reaches out when you stop chasing. It shows you who values your presence without being reminded of it. And it also shows you who was only present because you were doing all the emotional work. But perhaps the most important revelation is internal. Silence shows you that you can survive without constant reassurance, that you can sit with uncertainty without collapsing into anxiety, that your worth does not rise or fall based on someone else's engagement. In that space, something powerful happens. The urgency to fix, to chase, to explain begins to dissolve. And what remains is clarity.
Not bitterness,
Not,
revenge.
but clarity. And clarity is where self-respect finally becomes unshakable. Chasing someone who repeatedly withdraws creates an emotional imbalance that slowly reshapes how you see yourself. At first, it feels like effort, care, and commitment. You tell yourself that love requires persistence, that understanding someone means giving them space while still staying close, and that if you just try a little harder, the distance will eventually close. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. You stop noticing the imbalance and you start normalizing it. In a healthy emotional dynamic, effort flows both ways. There is a natural rhythm of reaching out and responding, of giving and receiving, of presence and return. But when one person consistently withdraws and the other consistently pursues, that rhythm breaks. One side becomes the initiator of connection and the other becomes the gatekeeper of it. And in that structure, emotional weight is no longer shared, it is carried disproportionately. What makes this particularly dangerous is how gradual it feels. You don't wake up one day and decide to abandon yourself. It happens slowly, through repeated moments of over-explaining, over-texting, over-analyzing, and over-giving. Each time you reach out and receive less than what you hoped for, you adjust your expectations instead of questioning the pattern. You start telling yourself things like, they are just busy, they need space, or this is just how they are. But beneath those explanations, your nervous system is registering something else: inconsistency. And the human nervous system does not respond well to emotional inconsistency. It creates anxiety, uncertainty, and a constant need for resolution. That is why chasing someone who withdraws often feels addictive. The unpredictability keeps you mentally engaged, always trying to solve what is missing. Over time, this dynamic begins to affect your self-worth in quiet ways. You may not consciously think, I'm not enough, but your behavior starts to reflect that belief. You begin to work harder for attention that should feel natural. You begin to accept less communication, less clarity, less emotional reciprocity. And slowly, your internal standard shifts. What once felt like insufficient connection begins to feel normal. And that normalization is the real loss, not the person, but the erosion of your emotional baseline. In contrast, when someone is emotionally present and consistent, there is no confusion. You do not have to decode silence or interpret distance. You do not have to earn their attention repeatedly. You simply experience it. That contrast becomes clearer only when you step out of the chasing pattern. Chasing also creates an internal conflict. One part of you knows you are overextending, while another part hopes that persistence will eventually be rewarded. This tension drains emotional energy. It keeps you in a loop of anticipation and disappointment. You are always waiting for the next response, the next sign, the next moment of clarity that rarely comes in a consistent way. And in that waiting, you begin to lose presence in your own life. Your attention shifts outward toward their behavior, their timing, their words, their silence. Instead of living your emotional experience, you begin managing it. You become reactive rather than grounded. But the most powerful realization comes when you step back and observe the pattern without emotional urgency. You begin to see that effort alone cannot replace mutual willingness. No amount of explaining can create emotional availability where it does not exist. No level of patience can substitute for consistent engagement. This is where self-respect becomes essential.
Not as an abstract idea, but as a practical boundary. Self-respect says,
I will not continuously invest in a connection that requires me to shrink, chase, or question my worth. Because real connection does not demand pursuit at the cost of your peace. It does not require you to abandon your emotional stability just to maintain proximity. When connection is right, it does not feel like chasing, it feels like meeting. And when you finally stop chasing, something important returns to you. Not just clarity about the other person, but clarity about yourself. You begin to see how much energy was being spent trying to hold together something that was never stable on both sides. That awareness is not loss. It is liberation, real strength. In relationships is often misunderstood. Many people are taught, directly or indirectly, that strength means endurance, staying longer, tolerating more, explaining repeatedly, and holding on even when clarity is absent. But emotional strength is not measured by how much confusion you can survive. It is measured by how clearly you can define your boundaries and how consistently you can honor them. A boundary is not an act of distance or punishment.
it is an act of self-definition.
It is the quiet declaration that says, this is what I will allow in my emotional world, and this is what I will not. Without boundaries, relationships become reactive. You respond to every shift, every silence, every inconsistency, trying to adjust yourself in real time to maintain connection. But in that constant adjustment, you slowly lose your center. Boundaries bring you back to that center. When someone is emotionally avoidant or inconsistent, it is easy to fall into the pattern of over-accommodation. You start lowering your expectations not because they are met, but because you are trying to reduce emotional tension. You tell yourself that being patient is the same as being strong. But patience without boundaries becomes self-erasure. It turns into a quiet agreement to accept less than what you actually need. True strength begins when you stop confusing tolerance with love. Setting a boundary does not require anger or confrontation. In its highest form, it is calm, steady, and internally anchored. It does not demand that the other person change, it simply clarifies how you will respond to their behavior. For example, instead of repeatedly chasing inconsistent communication, you allow consistency to become a requirement for your engagement. Not as a threat, but as a reflection of your emotional standards. This shift is subtle but powerful, because now you are no longer reacting to every emotional fluctuation. You are observing patterns and responding from a place of self-respect. Rather than urgency, you are no longer asking, how can I get them to show up for me? You are asking, Is this dynamic aligned with the way I want to be treated? That question changes everything. Boundaries also protect your emotional energy. Without them, you become accessible at all times, emotionally available even when reciprocity is absent. You answer inconsistencies with more effort. You respond to distance with more closeness. And over time, your emotional world becomes unbalanced. You are constantly giving, adjusting, and hoping while receiving uncertainty in return. But when boundaries are present, your energy is no longer freely dispersed. It becomes directed. You invest where there is mutual presence, and you step back where there is persistent imbalance. This is not withdrawal from love, it's refinement of how you participate in it. One of the most important realizations about boundaries is that they are not about controlling others. They are about controlling access. You cannot force someone to be consistent, available, or emotionally present. But you can decide what level of inconsistency you are willing to remain connected to. And that decision is where power returns. Because without boundaries, you are constantly negotiating your worth in real time. Every delayed message becomes a question. Every shift in tone becomes a signal to analyze. Every withdrawal becomes something you try to repair. But with boundaries, you step out of negotiation and into clarity. You no longer interpret every behavior as something you must fix. Instead, you observe, you understand, and you choose. This is where emotional maturity begins to replace emotional reaction. You stop trying to earn what should already be mutual. You stop over-functioning in relationships where balance is missing. And most importantly, you stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional security. Real strength is not loud. It does not chase. It does not plead. It does not collapse. Under uncertainty, it stands firm in awareness. And when you live from that place, something profound happens. You stop shrinking to maintain connection, and you start expanding to honor yourself. Emotional detachment, when misunderstood, is often confused with coldness, indifference, or emotional shutdown. But in its true form, it is none of these things. Healthy detachment is not about shutting your heart, it is about freeing your nervous system from attachment to outcomes you cannot control. It is the ability to care without collapsing, to feel without losing yourself, and to observe without being pulled into emotional chaos. When someone is emotionally inconsistent, sometimes closed, sometimes distant, it naturally creates a state of internal tension. The mind begins to search for certainty and uncertainty. You start analyzing messages, timing, tone, silence, and distance. You try to decode meaning from absence. And in doing so, your emotional state becomes dependent on external behavior. That is unpredictable. This is where suffering quietly begins. Emotional detachment interrupts that dependency. It does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop surrendering your inner stability to someone else's inconsistency. You still feel, but you are no longer controlled by what you feel in response to them. You begin to create a space between stimulus and reaction. In that space, clarity returns. Without detachment, emotional dynamics often become reactive cycles. When they withdraw, you pursue. When they become distant, you become anxious. When they respond, you feel relief. This creates a loop where your emotional equilibrium is constantly shifting based on their availability. Over time, this weakens your sense of internal stability. You begin to lose touch with what you feel independently of them. Detachment restores that independence. It allows you to observe behavior without immediate emotional collapse. Instead of reacting instantly to silence, you pause. Instead of interpreting distance as rejection, you consider patterns. Instead of trying to fix uncertainty through effort, you allow clarity to emerge through observation. This shift is subtle but transformative because now you are no longer inside the emotional storm, you are witnessing it. And from that position, you gain access to something you did not have before. Perspective. Perspective is powerful because it removes urgency. And when urgency dissolves, so does the compulsive need to chase, explain, or prove yourself. You begin to realize that not every emotional gap needs to be filled by you. Not every silence requires your response. Not every withdrawal requires your pursuit. Detachment also protects your identity. In emotionally intense dynamics, it is easy to merge your sense of worth with another person's behavior. If they are attentive, you feel valued. If they are distant, you feel diminished. But this creates an unstable identity that fluctuates with external validation. Through detachment, you begin to separate your value from their participation. You recognize that your worth is not being created or destroyed by their engagement. It exists independently of their ability to show up consistently. This is where emotional freedom begins. You are no longer trying to earn stability from someone who is inconsistent. You are no longer interpreting their emotional limitations as your personal inadequacy. Instead, you begin to see clearly. Their behavior reflects their capacity, not your value. And once that truth is internalized, something powerful happens. You stop over-investing in uncertainty. You stop over-functioning in imbalance. You stop abandoning your own peace to maintain access to someone who cannot offer emotional consistency. Detachment also changes how you experience silence. What once felt like rejection begins to feel like information. Silence is no longer a trigger for anxiety, it becomes a signal for awareness. You begin to ask different questions. Not how do I fix this, but is this alignment healthy for me? That shift in questioning changes your entire emotional architecture. Because now you are not inside the reaction, you are outside it, observing with clarity. And from that clarity, you begin to make decisions that are no longer driven by fear of loss, but by respect for yourself. You realize that peace is not found in controlling others is found in releasing attachment to what you cannot control. And in that release, you don't become less emotional, you become more free. Healing begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself in the pursuit of emotional validation. Most people think healing is about time passing or about the other person changing or about finally getting closure from someone who is inconsistent. But real healing does not depend on their behavior. It begins internally when you make a quiet but powerful decision. You will no longer trade your self-worth for temporary connection.
When
emotional dependency takes hold, it creates a subtle form of internal fragmentation. Part of you knows you deserve clarity, consistency, and respect. But another part of you keeps hoping that if you just wait a little longer, try a little harder, or understand a little more, things will shift. This creates an emotional split. One part of you is grounded in truth, while the other is attached to possibility. And in that gap, suffering grows. Healing starts when you stop feeding the part of you that is addicted to uncertainty. Self-value is not a concept, it is a practice. It is reflected in the smallest decisions you make when no one is watching. Do you reach out again when someone consistently withdraws? Do you over-explain your feelings to someone who repeatedly misunderstands or ignores them? Do you continue to invest energy in a dynamic that repeatedly leaves you confused? Each of these moments is a turning point. Not because the other person defines your worth, but because you rend. Response defines your alignment with yourself. When you begin to choose self-value over emotional dependency, something shifts in your nervous system. At first, it feels uncomfortable. The urge to reach out may still be strong. The habit of seeking reassurance may still arise. But instead of acting on impulse, you begin to observe it. You start noticing the difference between emotional craving and emotional truth. That awareness is the beginning of healing, because dependency thrives on unconscious reaction. It needs you to respond automatically to silence, to distance, to inconsistency. But when you introduce awareness, you interrupt the pattern. You create space between feeling and action. And in that space, choice emerges. And choice is where freedom begins. As you continue choosing yourself in small ways, your internal landscape begins to change. The urgency softens. The emotional spikes become less intense. The need for constant validation begins to weaken. You start to Realize that peace does not come from someone else finally showing up. It comes from you no longer abandoning yourself when they do not. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is a gradual reorganization of your emotional priorities. You begin to value clarity over confusion, consistency over intensity, and peace over unpredictable connection. And slowly, what once felt emotionally compelling begins to feel emotionally misaligned. Healing also changes your perception of silence. What once felt like rejection begins to feel like redirection. Not everything that leaves your emotional life is a loss. Some patterns leave because they were never stable enough to support your growth. And when you stop resisting that truth, you stop reopening emotional wounds. You also begin to recognize that emotional dependency often disguises itself as love. But love that consistently destabilizes your inner peace is not love in its highest form. It is attachment without balance. Real healing is when you can acknowledge care for someone without needing to remain entangled in their inconsistency. And perhaps the most important part of healing is this. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop trying to prove it. You stop offering more of yourself in hopes of receiving what should already be mutual. Instead, you begin to embody it. You act in ways that reflect your value, even when it is not mirrored back to you. Over time, this creates a new emotional baseline. You no longer feel drawn to dynamics that require self-abandonment. You no longer confuse intensity with connection. You no longer mistake emotional unpredictability for depth. Instead, you become anchored. Not because life becomes perfect, but because your relationship with yourself becomes clear. And from that clarity, healing is no longer something you are trying to reach. It becomes something you are living.